Welcome to Know Your Food, the podcast where we explore the world of food by speaking with farmers, makers, entrepreneurs, and experts who are reshaping how we think about what we eat. I'm your host, Michael Ray Robinoff, CEO and co-founder of Farm to People, and we're recording these conversations live from our warehouse in Bushwick, Brooklyn. In today's episode, I sit down with Reenie Karim, recipe developer, writer, and author of the brand new cookbook, Make It Plant-Based, Southern. Reenie's work reimagines the bold, comforting flavors of Southern cuisine through a plant-based lens, honoring both her Bangladeshi roots and her Southern upbringing. We talk about the power of food memory, how she has built a unique path for her career, and why plant-based cooking can often be even more accessible using pantry items. She also shares what it was like writing her first cookbook and how she hopes to invite more people into the kitchen, no matter their skill level. Thanks for tuning in to Know Your Food. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and share it with someone who loves food with heart. Now, here's my conversation with Reenie Karim. Thank you so much, Reenie, for coming back to Farm to People. It feels like a homecoming, and congrats on your new amazing cookbook. It's so cool to see how much you've done in such a short period of time since you were here, which feels like yesterday, for an amazing residency. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I keep bothering you year after year to welcome me back, and happy to be here.
It's never a bother, and also congrats on expecting. It's amazing.
Thanks.
So much has changed in a year, too. So to jump in, for us and for this series, it's always been a privilege that I tell people I get to experience so many amazing folks behind the food system, whether they're farmers or chefs or writers or professors or bakers, you name it. And the incredible work they get to do, in many cases behind the scenes, really like shaping our food system. And I thought, these are amazing conversations. I'm so fortunate to get to have them. How can we create a platform to share those more widely? And so thank you for being here, especially bringing your platform and all of the work that you do to bring your food, your culture to the forefront through your cooking and helping put knowing your food more on a pedestal. And so usually we end with this question, but I think when we were chatting, it became so important to me to jump in with your perspective and your personal ethos as it relates to food and to cooking. And you've mentioned that so many people consider cooking a luxury or a hobby, but what does it mean to you?
Wow. Okay. First of all, thanks for giving that preface, because I think that very beautifully explains why we're even here today, to discuss what it means to know your food. And as you were describing the food systems and the people behind it, usually I wouldn't consider myself somebody behind the food system, but when I think about it, there are so many influences in food media that have this domino effect on farming, agriculture, what even allows us to buy the ingredients we can buy. And I think my answer will flow into that. I believe that it's a shame that when you meet somebody who knows how to cook, or you go to a home cooked dinner party, anything like that, it's seen as such a skill or a hobby that you either choose to possess or you don't. It's just a shame that we've been raised in a society that intentionally separates us from being in touch with our knowledge about ingredients, where they come from, and what skills we're able to learn from these ingredients, because we're also constantly plastered with fast food, literal political agendas to prevent us from understanding how to read a nutrition label. There's a reason why we're growing up in a food illiterate society, and that's my hot take in general. It's just a freaking shame. That's our starting point, especially in Western society. I just wish we could all start over with our relationship with food and see it the same way we see any sort of common knowledge we use day to day, and expect us as humans to understand. I always say that if I was on the subway hot takes Instagram or TikTok, my hot take would be that you're not a real adult if you don't know how to cook. And that's just my mean hot take. That's not what I actually intend to say. But I do wish that people felt more freedom, joy, and accessibility in making mistakes in how they make their food, and had more time to do it. because that's usually the barrier to people taking the time to make food, is because they're afraid to take risks and waste their time.
Digging in even a little deeper there, I think looking at cool chefs or looking at cool restaurants and sort of feeling the pressure, it's almost like you're looking at how amazing this complicated recipe is and feeling really intimidated to even try cooking. Like there's like sort of this like, if I'm not great at cooking, maybe I shouldn't even do it at all. And I think what you're trying to say and what cultures and history were like is like the kid cooking with the grandparents or just like making dinner was not just a chore, but like a gathering place. The kitchen was a place where the family got together and you learned by osmosis. You would watch someone do something, you would cut some carrots, you'd learn this from a very young age. And convenience and societal pressures have removed us from this connection from food, both in a family sense and in a farming sense. Something maybe the audience doesn't know, but I think is important to our mission at Farm to People is, 7% of Americans were farmers a century ago. Today, it's less than 2%. So like, if you think about it that way, also like we all knew we were all more likely to know our farmers or to have a family member that was a farmer not that long ago, like a generation or two ago. And now we don't. We're disconnected from the people that grow our food. And in many cases now the people that cook our food. Is that sort of what you're seeing and to some degree what you wish were different?
Absolutely. And it's a terrifying statistic. Honestly, when you were saying the 6 or 7%, I thought you were talking about now, because that even just back 2 centuries ago is quite a small portion of Americans. It makes so much sense because of what I know about how much our government disadvantages our agricultural system. It's a shame when I think about how in Bangladeshi culture, for example, every Bangladeshi family I know that grew up in the US has a garden. So even if we don't have a full-on farm, we had a yard or some accessibility to understanding what goes into making your own food and produce and valuing the time and effort that goes into fresh food. It's a huge cultural privilege of mine to have been raised with that mindset. It's just sad to know that the only cure to that is probably overthrowing a lot of political systems and doing our best to normalize and hopefully make it seem more accessible and a priority. The same way we all know how to read, most of us. Literacy rates are also going down. But if we treated cooking like reading, no matter how good you are at it, it's still what you need to like function through the world, I think it'd be a better place.
I mean, we can get into the education system too, but you're so right. I think it's a life skill that we don't value enough, knowing how to farm and how to do things like that. These should be valued much, much higher. It's super important. And a lot of the system currently is around making not necessarily good or nutritious food accessible, just like food cheap and fast. It's at the expense of our knowledge. And what we're seeing residually is also our health. What I think is really beautiful, we're both meat eaters. I think we also, as a society, eat probably way too much, not probably, we eat too much meat. We like always want to have meat as a centerpiece on our plate. That's what culture and society have deemed as dinner. Mm-hmm. I love that you, as a meat eater, have decided to embark on looking at particularly Southern cuisine, which has a stereotype for being meat heavy, dairy heavy, in general, have made it plant-based. And so talk to me about your journey into the Make It Plant-Based series and why you embarked on particularly this cuisine. I know you're from Atlanta, so talk to me about all of that and your history in getting to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for clarifying that. We are both meat eaters. I post steak quite often. If you follow me on Instagram. I've eaten your steak, yeah. That's true.
At Egg.
Oh my gosh. But that's the thing, is that it's almost going back to what we just talked about. Understanding how to cook in general, that is my gateway to wanting to cook with a variety of ingredients, and that those aren't always going to be animal-based proteins. And the reason it's not going to be animal-based proteins is because I need to cook conveniently at home when I am trying to put something together that covers the nutrients I want to intake. And like, this isn't by any means a diet book or a nutrition forward book. It is simply a love letter to knowing how to cook from your pantry. And oftentimes the easiest pantry ingredients to cook with are plant-based because they're not going bad anytime soon, and they're accessible because they're canned, or they're able to be preserved for a while because they're pickled, or they're soy products like tofu and nuts. And all of these products are actually so easy to manipulate in your kitchen. We just don't do it because we've already typecasted food without a main protein, at least in South Asian culture. Because I am from the South. My parents are from South Asia. And so the communities we grew up with, we're often taught from a frugality perspective that if you're not eating protein, like if you're not full, then you didn't get what's worth out of your meal. And so that's something that I've had to battle, not really battle, but like introduce other South Asian friends and families to, was the idea that you can have an incredibly worthy meal that isn't centered around meat necessarily. This is very specific to Muslim South Asian communities because I think so many incredible plant-based techniques actually come out of India from Hindu traditions of cooking without animal products. There's also a plant-based Indian cookbook, but this plant-based Southern cookbook experiments with so many cross-sections of Asian and American cooking because actually growing up in the South, it felt very natural to see a variety of ingredients used in a plethora of ways that don't speak to one culture or another. Because where I grew up, we had the highest percentage of refugee populations, for example, in Metro Atlanta. So Atlanta is where I grew up tasting all of my first, essentially, like a variety of regional cuisines. And a lot of them were often plant-based. And the history of plant-based cooking in America often comes from soul food and Southern food, like vegan mac and cheese. There's a vegan fried chicken sandwich in here. That is not a brand new concept. People in the South have been veganizing their foods for a very long time because they also care very deeply about sustainability and their culture. So yeah, I haven't invented anything new. It's just my perspective about easy, fresh, and interesting recipes that hopefully require you to do less work. The only work you have to do is like mental work to get over your stigmas about certain ingredients.
What were some of the flavors that you highlight in the book that aren't typically thought of as vegan? Maybe like a fried chicken sandwich, anything else like that, that you were like, wow, I'm rethinking this. It's even maybe more delicious than what we typically think of as its non-vegan alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of them, actually, we have it here today, the spiced peach jam and labna. I was just explaining to a friend how the labna is from coconut yogurt. I always skip the coconut yogurt section at my market, but it's such an interesting ingredient to manipulate when you're using spices and aromatics, because coconut we associate often with East Asian cooking. And so this jam is made with just like a regular peach jam. You start frying with garlic and some whole spices, and it tastes a lot like a chutney. And chutneys, one of my favorite chutneys is like a dry coconut chutney that you eat with dosa, which is a South Indian dish. It's delicious.
Yeah.
And so like the mixing of these whole spices and aromatics with coconut, it makes a hell of a lot of sense using vegan coconut yogurt that you just, you mix with some salt and sugar and you strain it for a little bit, and you have this really creamy base for now like a pungent chutney that you just made from a jar of peach jam. And that speaks to a variety of flavors that I've grown up eating, because I've also eaten a lot of Southeastern Asian flavors, but the vessel of like a dip and peaches, which are all very endemic to the South.
I think coconut yogurt is an incredible alternative to yogurt. It's got a richness and flavor profile that the coconut cream is just really, it's a very delicious component.
Coconut cream is a powerhouse.
Yeah.
And it makes sense in so many of our favorite foods that we just don't associate with vegan food. I think we just have to stop associating plant-based with health and just start taking it out of the buckets we put it in.
I so agree with that statement. I think part of it is also this need to like label everything and create brands around plant-based, or even like the fact that vegan turned into a dirty word, so to speak. Like people were like, oh, I don't want to call it vegan. Like, let's rebrand it all to plant-based, like this idea.
Yeah, these dirty vegans. Yeah, we have to call it something new now.
It's like, why? Like, let's just bring back great vegetables prepared really deliciously. And like you mentioned, Indian cuisine is pretty much entirely vegetarian and it's delicious. And why do we need to label it anything other than Indian cuisine and really just appreciate it for the amazing flavors that come out of it? And so I want to like reclaim just that and like this idea that it doesn't need to be looked at positively or negatively based on like some marketing term.
Exactly. It could just turn out that you're trying an Indian recipe that happens to be plant-based and it could be your favorite. And it turns out you like South Indian food. Like that's what that means. It doesn't say anything else about your dietary restrictions.
Yeah, totally. So I guess we kind of touched on this. You're part of this Make It Plant-Based cookbook series. It's part of, you know, globally inspired vegan series, not just about the South. But why did Southern food feel like the right fit for you?
Great question. Fun fact, I was born in Auburn, Alabama. That's the first place my parents immigrated to from Bangladesh. There's a long story there, but we never left the South. For about 7 years, my parents moved our family around between Alabama, Augusta, Georgia, then Kentucky, then Tennessee, then Houston, Texas. And this is literally my years of life 1 through 6. I was very young, obviously. That's not to say that's where my food memories came from, but we settled down north of Atlanta, about like 25, 30 minutes north. And I spent the rest of my life up until graduating college in Georgia. That's where I started learning about and absorbing American culture. It became synonymous with Southern culture. I went to the University of Georgia, which is a very, like if anyone knows about UGA or the SEC football.
Great football team, yeah.
Yeah, go Dogs, question mark.
Bulldog,
like these
right?
are...
Yeah. I watch football sometimes.
Okay, thanks. Great. You have more to say about the football half than I do, but I was consuming a lot of Southern culture without even really knowing it, even though a lot of my pop-ups, even my first pop-up here was South by South Asian. These cuisines meld together so naturally because of their love of produce and seasonal produce, things that grow in the heat. Family style cooking, and I mean, I would say those are the two main indicators of how I would define a lot of my food. To really invest myself in the Southern angle felt like a love letter to who I was growing up that I've only been able to recognize since moving to New York. Now I've lived in New York for 6, almost 7 years this summer. And it's since I moved, classic story, that I now appreciate where I came from and blah, 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 blah. And my brother and sister-in-law, his wife, live in Georgia. If you read the acknowledgments in the book, I actually thank my brother Sadat and his wife Jess for introducing me to so much of the culture that I missed out on as an adult. Because as a young adult, I moved straight up to first DC for a year and then New York. And it's only through my retrospect that I've been able to go back and identify how it's made me who I am. So it was very much a choice to invest more of my time in research in the recipes in this book and what my personal history says about my food identity today.
That's so beautiful. I feel like watching your career blossom, I probably, have known about you for 2.5 maybe of the 6 or 7 years that you've been in New York, but have gotten to hear from you. I got to meet your parents when you did the residency, so I know how much striking out on your own and following your passion and your love of food was a real, it really came from the heart, and it wasn't necessarily looked upon initially as a decision that you were nervous how your parents would perceive this career move. I think, one, you're an inspiration to us. So I think great on you for following that passion and that love. And I think for me personally, as someone who's inspired by you, I'd love to know about your journey into food, not just your journey into food from a personal perspective, but how you were able to take that love of cooking, love of your culture, both in South Asia and how you grew up in the South of America. That sounded wrong, but the American South. And how did you evolve that history and that love into a career that is, now you're a published cookbook author, and on top of all the other amazing things you've done, from next level chef to being in the Bon Appetit test kitchen to all the pop-ups.
Wow, this is therapy now. These are the questions my husband tries to make me answer to feel grateful every night or to feel accomplished. So I'm going to try to answer it now Thanks for the practice runs, Grace. It's hard to actually account for everything you've just said, because this is both a double-edged sword, but the reason, I think, and the answer to this question, the reason this was all possible is because I have a neurotic pledge to transparency and authenticity. Authenticity is a very loose word these days because it's thrown around to make you believe in what you're buying. Maybe another word for authenticity is actually honesty. And it's so important to me, whether I'm facing you like in an Instagram reel or I'm having a conversation with you one-on-one, before I was ever posting recipes for the sake of asking people to cook my recipes, I have always been so passionate about sharing what I know, how I learned it, and why I think it's important. Before I was ever in food, I was in communications for sexual and reproductive health, and that helped gear the way I communicate about everything I care about, because it allowed me to see an opportunity to express myself as an opportunity to share what I've learned and who I've learned it from. And I believe that is where I have gotten used to growth. Some people say like, wow, you've done so much so quickly, or like in such a short amount of time. But a lot of the skills I've learned, like writing, for example, came before. Like, it came to a commitment I made years ago when I started grad school for sexual and reproductive health, because I wanted to learn how to become a community organizer and communicator about very difficult topics. By the time I decided to invest my time in food and food media, it was already natural for me to identify, how do people feel about like XYZ topic? How do people feel about this ingredient, this idea I have? And it was very natural for me to investigate the crap out of anything that I wanted to share with others. I never feel comfortable speaking about or advertising something that I'm not already confidently involving in my own life. So by the time I was doing pop-ups, for example, it's only because I had already worked as a recipe developer at Bon Appetit. It's only because I had gone on to Next Level Chef and been in very difficult kitchen situations and tested myself before I bring that test to the public, if that makes sense. So I really challenge myself internally to make sure that I've learned everything I need to learn out of an experience before I move on to the next one or try something new. And some people may say that, you know, that can like limit you, or you should be more confident. Confidence to me is making mistakes on my own, growing from them before I attempt to exploit perceived success. Whatever success I have and whatever perceived success I have, I feel confident in having earned it because there's so much quiet work that has been done before it to sort of like dummy test everything I say and feel like I can do.
That's also
my
think,
therapy.
Yeah, no. I want to go. Let's keep the therapy session going for one more second. I think one of the things that feels very authentic is the fact that you, beyond speaking your mind and being very clear about your principles and what you want to see out in the world and embodying that, which I think we all appreciate as your fans, is also there is a varied trajectory. Like, you've done so much, but it's not only just one thing, which I find very refreshing because it really feels like specific to you, Reenie. It's like you're following your passion through the winding ways of wherever that leads you. And I think that's also in and of itself some form of confidence. You didn't just get good at one thing and stop there and rinse and repeat. It's like, where does that one thing that you're great at lead to the next thing that you don't know that you're going to be great at it? You happen to be multi-talented, but you didn't know that going into it. So like, how did you have that confidence and build upon that from one project to the next, as it was sort of like starting out in a test kitchen? How did you take that test kitchen experience to leverage that into an opportunity to be on national TV? How did you then say, like, national TV, while it has its challenges, is very different than to then go to a Bushwick restaurant and be like, I want to serve, 150 people a night, to then write a book. Talk us through the I think there's grit that people maybe don't see.
Yeah.
And I'm sure uncertainty in yourself. And so like, I want people to know that even when, sometimes you can just look at someone's Instagram and there is this idea, like there's this success, but I know how hard you work at that and how much uncertainty there. It was never clear that any of this might have been a successful foray into something different than what you had done prior.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for actually highlighting that exact sentiment. It never was certain. Like, I never knew each time I turned a different direction if that direction was going to get me here 2-3 years later. And I do think that pure intention to learn is what helps me keep that focus in the moment. To give a specific example, the very first pop-up I did, which there are people here who've been to that pop-up before, Farm to People, I did my very first pop-up at a restaurant in Williamsburg that paid me nothing, like zero. And I remember thinking, that's totally fine because I'm so damn lucky to be here. And, you know, if I can just learn something from this experience, then I have everything I need from this. That's one, a privilege to be able to spend time working on something that's not going to pay you. A huge disadvantage that I took to my own skills at the time and self-worth. It took someone pulling me out of that bubble, a mentor, to explain to me and reflect to me what I was capable of. And I currently even spend a lot of time in friction with some of my friends and mentors who do attempt to push me to expect more or like understand my worth. But the uncertainty that goes into it and that I feel day to day, whether it's the pop-up that I earned nothing from, but I, you know, got to see people enjoy, etc., all of these moments give me just enough to push myself a step further and work that much harder. So to compare that first pop-up to the one I most recently did at Rolo's, which if anyone knows about the restaurant Rolo's, it's a hard reservation to get. It's something that I only take my family when they visit, things like that. And when they asked me to do a pop-up with them, that was a huge, frightening moment. That was like a nightmare for me. I was eating dinner there and then they asked me to tour their kitchen. And I was like, why? I don't want to know where this conversation goes because I was so afraid to experience how unprepared I would feel if they asked me to collaborate. But I did. I experienced that fear. And I think practicing normalizing fear in your day-to-day will go a really far way. And I think that's where a lot of like my grit lies per se, is that I just kind of normalize the experience of feeling fear. I've understood that this is a process that has and will continue to take me far. If I'm uncomfortable, I'm probably in a moment of growth. Obviously, it's not healthy to like be scared the entire way, but it's a really great place to gauge how much you have to learn and whether you want to commit to learning it. So by the time when Rolo's did approach me, I made a plan for myself after that. Like, okay, if I do reach back out to them and accept this, I'm going to propose a plan in which I can learn from them and not just step in and do a pop-up thinking that I know what I'm doing. I'm going to propose myself as a student first. And that was really helpful for me. And by the time I worked on that pop-up with them and was working in their kitchen, I was frightened because these are, again, like Michelin star chefs that have come from really great restaurants in New York into this one kitchen that make up my favorite restaurant. If I ruin this, I'm like ruining my reputation with them, my reputation in general. Being as honest with them about where I'm at, what I'm going to do. Also was 6 months pregnant when I did that.
Yeah, nuts.
All of the above. That level of awareness of what I can do, and also I had to give myself credit when I was communicating with them, because if they sensed my own fear, that would be the biggest disadvantage to that process. It's not about fake confidence, it's simply just presenting yourself with the awareness of what do I want them to remember me by. Because I always have these moments when I go home and before I go to sleep, I'm like, oh my God, I let that person think I was an idiot. That's something a lot of women do. That's something a lot of people of color do. There's all types of reasonings behind it. But yeah, really counting and understanding where fear belongs and where your self-awareness and like sense of worth belongs, and some combination of these two.
Yeah, I think that's something that is so much easier said than done, but like fear or stress or different things that are uncomfortable human sentiments are also like you're tolerant, but just like working out, if you run a mile and you haven't worked out in a year, you may not even be able to run a mile. You might not finish. And then, if you do that every day, all of a sudden you're running 2 miles or 3 miles. It's building a muscle. And I've heard that a lot and experienced it personally. And I think when I have a similar feeling that if you push yourself into certain moments of discomfort, you become better at handling discomfort and growing through that discomfort. And it's clear you do that to yourself, I think, consciously and over again, which is inspiring to me. And I think something to normalize. And I would say to you, like, there is no, like, the embarrassment that you might feel of a failure in any way, like 9 times out of 10, other people don't even see that failure or recognize that failure. And that's a big thing to remember. Like,
Right.
you're holding yourself to this insane level of greatness, which is important. But other people probably don't see the little blemishes too. And I think we get so caught up in our own self-conscious. What you said is, I just want to echo that. You're totally right. And we should encourage our friends and our colleagues and others to take those risks. I think those are important risks.
Actually, if I may, to just continue this tangent a little bit longer, I have a very tangible example of where I exercise this, but it's also very trivial. But if anyone knows, or if anyone else is a content creator, they know that on Instagram specifically, you can hide your likes. You can hide the amount of likes that people can see. And the whole point of this, or the reason why Instagram put this setting on, so that you feel more comfortable keeping your posts up if they don't get a lot of likes. And so this is like one of the few like internal ways where I'm like, what am I doing to myself if I start using this feature? If I, for whatever reason, want to present something to the public, but now want to hide how many people have interacted with it. What does this mean about me or how I feel about what I've shared if I can't handle this statistic being public? That's one of the ways, my own embarrassment, my own fears of how I'm perceived. Those are like the tiniest examples of like pills I try to swallow consistently so that I can stay focused on what actually matters to me. And obviously, like, everyone has some level of embarrassment. Everyone has some level of strategicness also when sharing on social media. But that to me is one of the small ways in which your day to day, you can start to understand, this is something that bothers me. What am I going to do about it? How do I present myself honestly, both to myself and to the public?
Because I want to make sure we have more time to go into the, thank you for this, it's been therapy for me too. I want to talk about zooming ahead to a cookbook and how your approach to cooking and recipe development has shifted from being in the kitchen, being on a TV show and in a restaurant. How have you translated that process to the page?
Ooh, okay, yeah, definitely timeliness. That's something I think about a lot when developing these recipes. If I was gonna say from being on Next Level Chef, if anyone watched it, it's all real. Like, I'm grabbing ingredients from a platform. It's stressful and everyone wants to know how I make something up in 30 seconds or less. What people don't see from watching these episodes is that in addition to the 30 seconds I have grabbing these ingredients, I also have a lifetime of like memories of the foods, of meals that I have made at home. Those are all vehicles. These are formulas. I know how to make a chicken sandwich. I know how to make a curry. I know how to make a fried fillet of fish. Let's compare those 30 seconds grabbing things from a platform on TV to the 5 minutes I have looking at my pantry or my freezer at home. I need to be confident in recipe formulas and know how to swap things in and out of it so that when I do grab a sauce or a paste or a main or a protein or whatever, I at least have a menu already designed in the back of my head. And this book, actually, for most of the recipes, there's a sidebar after each recipe that says, I think it's freestyle it or mealify it. So this book is also trying to teach you how to integrate the recipes into your day-to-day life and hold your hand while you customize each recipe. So it's going to explain ways in which you can make these recipes your own so that you don't feel confined to the ingredients written in that page. And I think that comes from the experience of both developing recipes for food magazines and from literally cooking on a show where you're meant to think on the fly and customize constantly.
I think more people need to think about ingredients as interchangeable and not be so rigid about that. And it'll make cooking more freeing. It'll make people want to do it more. It'll also make them be able to cook more seasonally, which is obviously a big thing for me and for farm to people, and being flexible about, eggplants aren't in season mostly in the Northeast,
Right.
but what are other, or summer squash or winter squash, or being able to use these different components. So I love that you're giving people permission to be creative, which is so important in using ingredients that maybe inspire them if they don't like the sort of initial suggestion.
In fact, I'm begging you to be more creative.
Good. What was the hardest part? I have not written a cookbook. What was the hardest part about writing this cookbook? Both logistically, also emotionally.
Emotionally, Michael.
Back to therapy.
Yeah. I guess I'll start with logistically then. Maybe that'll ring some bells about what emotionally messed me up. Well, logistically, I think what people don't see about recipe writing in general, nonetheless a collection of recipes, is that you are making so many assumptions about who your reader is. I personally loved the technical writing curriculum in my 4th grade literature class, but technical writing, by the way, is just writing instructions. So I thought I was very prepared to write a whole book of instructions. But writing instructions, writing a recipe, writing an intro to a recipe, all of these things require a very clear understanding of who your audience is, who your reader is. And I think I struggle with making too many assumptions, and I want to personify and imagine in my head who is making this recipe before I start writing these instructions and saying, take your stainless steel pan and place it in the oven. Who am I to say you have a stainless steel pan? So a lot of the choices I'm making in these recipes have to decide who these recipes are for right off the bat. And then emotionally, I think what can be terrifying about expressing yourself in any art form, but via a recipe that is meant to represent who you are, who your family is, who your points of inspiration are. It's so personal when you're sharing these pieces of yourself. And it's almost like you're trying to defend who you are in terms of food or in terms of a recipe. And I think a lot of people who've shared what they cook or bake understand that deeply. When they share something on the internet, it's suddenly a feast for like a bunch of haters or lovers, whoever, just a lot of opinions.
Yeah.
And nothing is ever going to be 100% perfect for everybody. And accepting that is a big feat.
This is like a piece of yourself that you're sharing. It's a creation, it is art, and it is something that, yeah, once it's out in the world, you can't really control what people think about it. Yeah, totally. I can imagine how that's intimidating and scary. On that note, and to sort of wrap up, I feel like, what advice would you give to someone thinking about writing their first cookbook?
My first piece of advice is always that you need to get to know who you are and what you have to say. That's usually my advice before anyone shares anything or creates anything publicly. Your most specific self-awareness and acceptance for who you particularly are, not what you think you are, not like some narrative you even wrote or like constructed about yourself tying together like your life history. It should feel so natural for you to continue to express yourself. If you can successfully run through that thought exercise and understand what it is you passionately, effortlessly could talk about and rant about and dream about constantly, it could be like a very specific angle. Like one of the most successful cookbooks was written by one of my friends. It's called Mayumu, and it's a dessert or pastry cookbook with Filipino twists. And she had like, for all intents and purposes, she had a limited following. She was not a well-known pastry chef. She's now a James Beard Award winner, and her book came out a few years ago, and it's still talked about constantly. And it is simply because it is the most effortless representation of who she is. It's Abby Blanket, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know. She is so naturally aware of her strengths and committed to what she has to say, despite what people have told her is popular, is not popular, this won't sell, this will sell. when somebody trusts your perspective, even if they can't relate to your perspective at all, they're going to be interested in it because all they know is that you're an expert in what you're sharing with them. And for me, at least, it's very easy to tell. I can usually make that judgment. And it would just also make your process easier if you want to write a cookbook and you are so comfortable with what it is you are writing and not forcing it.
Yeah. So I guess the essence of that is like, don't create it for what you think people want. Really create it for yourself. If you want it, if it's personal to you, if it's something you need to get out in the world, do that because there's probably other people that will appreciate that authenticity. Is that a good way to?
Absolutely. No, yeah, that's exactly it. Don't listen to what you think people want because they actually just want what you have to offer.
Yeah. Yeah. On that note, and last question, just because for everyone who's about to read your book, and I recommend everybody buy a copy, is there a recipe from your book that's a personal favorite or one that's that you want to become like a surprise hit, mostly because it's so personal to you, Reenie?
Yes, there is. And it's really not that sexy of a recipe. It's kale porridge. I'm serious. It's kale porridge. That's what it's called. I think it's kale porridge with crispy garlic chips in the recipe.
Like a savory porridge?
Yeah, and the reason why it's so important and personal to me is because it's the only reason I started eating kale and enjoying greens in general. I used to hate spinach and like every child, I guess. But I was maybe a sophomore in college when I was rooming with my best friend, and her mom would make this kale soup for my best friend Catherine. And I would watch her eat it, and it was like the ugliest color green, and it was very confusing looking to me. And then one day I tried it, and it was the most luxurious tasting soup. I also wasn't a soup person, but it's very hot in Georgia, so there's not really many opportunities to want to eat soup. But when I tasted it, I wondered why it was so delicious, and it turns out there was arborio rice, which is the rice that's used to make risotto, blended in with stock and kale and a lot of garlic. And this is very similar actually to how sometimes like dal or lentils are made. Very few ingredients. My version of this just calls for frying off garlic in a pot before simmering all this together. That fried garlic later gets added on top as a little crunchy topping. But all that garlic oil stays at the base of this porridge, and it's just like this creamy comfort food that you would never expect you would crave. And then all of a sudden, I'm like 20 years old asking my mom to make me kale porridge like Catherine's mom makes it. So that recipe changed my life when I was growing up, and I put it in this book hoping that people care.
Oh my God, I can't wait to try it. Well, Reenie, thank you so much for being here. Hopefully you think of us as like a second home, and you're always welcome. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Know Your Food, a podcast from Farm to People. If today's conversation got you thinking differently about what's on your plate or where it comes from, we'd love if you shared this episode with a friend or left us a review. It helps more people discover the folks reimagining the future of food from the ground up. And if you're in the New York tri-state area, you can shop from our network of small, regenerative, independent farms and makers at farmtopeople.com and stay in the loop by signing up for our newsletter or joining us on Instagram at farmtopeople. Until next time, eat well and know your food.